Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the NPTEL course on Modernization and Creative Communication. This is week 1, lecture 1. And in lecture 1, we would get to learn about the times in which we live and where we stand in terms of knowledge making and the problematics of the nomenclature, modernity and modernization. So we live in an era of ecological crisis. Now, in such a scenario, critical thinking doesn't simply yield forms of abolitionist criticism of Anthropocenity, which it views as accountable for the crisis, but produces revolutionary ideas of posthumanism. Now, these configurations, such as posthumanism, do not merely show how an infinite network of non-human mediations express what we view as human productions, but also foregrounds the non-human constructions of the human organic exclusivity. Now, adhering to post-human reconstruction of Anthropocenity in his book Climate of History in a Planetary Age, Dipesh Chakravarty not only views humanity as a geochemical force accountable for engendering or producing the current climate crisis, but creates a ground for rethinking this crisis as integral to planet's regenerative drive. However, thinkers such as Dipesh Chakravarty and posthumanist thinkers such as Jane Bennett stay bonded not only by producing a similar drive towards reducing the ocular singularity of human organicity or organizations into a precarious interplay of non-human forces, but by producing intensities of indifference or aversion towards historical readings or spatializations of any kind. I'd repeat this again. Thinkers such as Jane Bennett and Chakravarty, they are bonded not by a similar drive towards reducing the visible singularity of human organicity or organizations into an interplay of non-human forces, but by producing intensities of indifference or aversion towards historical readings or spatializations of any kind. They view such readings as racial, as provincial, an attempt to render exclusive focus on the workings of political apparatuses rather than showing how these workings remain affected by their grounding in deep history, deep time, and the micropolitics of the planet. Now, they consider such indifference and aversion to human history necessary for reconstructing humans into non-human or planetary assemblages, which they view as bearing some kind of a potential that may, yield or generate, fresh openings or clearings, or produce a kind of a movement towards the production of a new earth or a new planet. So, in such a climate of indifference to human history, how should we approach historical ideas such as modernization and modernity? In terms of knowledge making, the stance is one of indifference to historical episodes, historical periodization. That is what I have tried to point out in the beginning. Now, what in this sense, how do we go about positioning historical occurrences or periods like modernity or processes such as modernization? How do we position them? Should we position them as historical blocks of some kind and subject them to logics of historic periodization or geopoliticization? Now, this is a process that may entail viewing agencies we imagine to be accountable for the production of such ideas, such as modernization and modernity, as embedded in or as embodying a historically defined space and time. Would it be correct to view such agencies as arboreal emanations arising out of a particular cartographic locale? Probably not. And it is in this sense that post-humanist indifference to grand histories, as well as critically configured subaltern or micro histories, cannot be altogether ignored. Moreover, would it be an exaggeration to say that such histories carry out intellectual supplementation of geopolitical agendas or ideologically driven cartographical divides? However, decolonial criticism offers a form of intellectual resistance to such post-humanist aversion to histories in general and history of modernity in particular. Such a criticism offers a kind of unwavering attention to the history of modernity, while withdrawing from the ethicality of modernist knowledge systems. This is because it views modern history less as offering a kind of critical resistance to the European quest of empire, but more as an archival or a production site for preserving the colonial imaginary. In particular, its pedagogical exercises that had gone on to establish the inferiority of indigenous others. These were exercises that were meant to serve as the ground for the coming European community to engage with the non-European, non-West while for decolonial thinkers, modernity stood as an ambivalent phenomenon. For likes of Dipesh Chakravarti, it stood as a model. In his article, Model of Modernity, Dipesh Chakravarti claims that the nomenclature modern sparks off, alienating effects. He states words such as modern imply value judgments from which most contemporary historians would like to distance themselves. If someone is modern, then he or she is so with regard to somebody who is not. That somebody may come to be seen as backward or pre-modern or waiting to be made modern, consigned, as I put it, in provincializing Europe. This is Dipesh Chakravarti's statement. I'm quoting him. Consigned, as I put it, and he has put this in his book, the famous book, The Provincializing Europe, to the waiting room of history. Moreover, confusions multiply when it comes to understanding what the nomenclature modern means. The historian Patrick Wolf indicates colonialism's centrality to the global industrial order, to claim that the expropriated Aboriginal, enslaved African American, or endangered Asians is as thoroughly modern as the factory worker, bureaucrat, or flaneur of the metropolitan center. Now, Chakravarti exploits Patrick Wolf's claim to unsettle attempts to equate the nomenclature modern as marking a particular shift in one's sensibility, mirroring his epistemic acquisitions or achievement. Chakravarti states if these disparate figures are all equally modern and thoroughly so, then clearly their modernity has little to do with differences in the levels of education, urbanity, or any other forms of cultural capital. In what sense could then they be equally modern? Is modern then simply a synonym for the global industrial order? Even periodizing the intensities of modernity, organizing them into exclusive historical blocks, turns out to be equally problematic. In his article, Model of Modernity, Dipesh argues that the impetus to determine the exact spatio-temporal location of agencies that led to the production or genesis of early modernity was driven by historical agendas and teleology. For Chakravarti, European historians use the term early modernity interchangeably with late medievality, equating one with the other, not only to reflect the impossibility of approaching established historical periods as isolated or discontinuous moments, but to extend the historical life of what had previously been considered medieval, grafting onto it dimensions of nobility and grace, because it stood as a site of regression and anti-production. On the other hand, the historians of South Asia moved in opposite direction, choosing to view indigenous past extending into centuries before British rule as the site of early modernity. To corroborate his view, Chakravarti refers to Sanjay Subramaniam's essay, Vignettes of Early Modernity in South Asia. Chakravarti claims that Subramaniam shows non-controversially that there were ideas about the public in pre-colonial India that did not conform to Habermas' idea of the public sphere, and he rejects rightly any preordained quest in pre-colonial Indian for equivalence to European developments. But his proposition that all this constituted some kind of early modernity still leaves us in dark about the meaning of the word modernity itself. The gamut of interactive processes that Subramaniam puts the spotlight on doesn't help him or us to identify ideas whose actualization or deployment gave birth to early modernity in pre-colonial India. He argues, for several years now, I have tried to argue that modernity is historically a global and a conjecture phenomenon. It is located in a series of historical processes that until now that brought relatively isolated societies into contact, and we must seek its roots in a set of diverse phenomena: the Mongol dream of world conquest, European voyages of exploration, activities of Indian textile traders in the diaspora, the globalization of microbes, with its emphasis on centrality of colonialism in the development of industrial modernization. Historians such as Patrick Wolf end up making the term modern a zone of ambiguity. With Wolf, the term modern doesn't indicate an exclusive set of people with high educational qualification. Rather, it stands as a dwelling for an indomesticable heterogeneity or a trans-identitarian collectivity associated with colonialism. Yet, Chakravarti goes on to clearly distinguish himself between the term modernity and modernization. Deepesh understands modernization in terms of infrastructural and institutional changes over time. Let me repeat this. Deepesh understands modernization in terms of infrastructural and institutional changes over time. He repositions examples that historians John F. Richards provide to explain the phrase early modernity as those that exemplify modernization instead. John F. Richards puts forward 6 distinct but complementary large-scale processes, such as global sea passages that led Europeans, explorations, mapping and reporting, the rise of a truly global world economy, the growth of large stable states and other large-scale complex organizations, the doubling of the world population, the intensified use of land involving destruction and or displacement of indigenous societies and the diffusion of several new technologies, new world crops, gunpowder and printing as indicative of early modernity. Yet, DePace views them as indicators of modernization. For he approaches modernity in terms of building institutions that both demands and entails such processes. Though Chakravarti realizes the interconnectedness between activisms and thinking, between the development of ideas and development of institutions, he understands modernity in terms of reflective, judgmental thinking or self-reflexivity. For Chakravarti, while modernization signals how mankind trumps over nature by building institutions, from parliamentary and legal institution to roads, capitalist business and factories, to the promotion of technological innovation, modernity indicates how humanity through reflective thinking trumps over itself, turning its institutions and infrastructures into routes and passages for actualizing human emancipation, rather than making them centers of political tyranny, clerical bigotry, and economic servitude. However, DePace uses John F. Richards' essay to firstly stress the ubiquity of modernization process. For him, according to him, modernization was everywhere. All societies were modernizing at the same time. Okay, there was certain kind of simultaneity about it. So John F. Richards' essay is used by DePace to stress the ubiquity of modernization process, and he positions modernization as a universal phenomenon. And secondly, he problematizes the interrelatedness of modernity and modernization. DePace finds the urge to modernize as integral to dynamics of human society. Now, he finds this urge to modernize as integral to dynamics of human society. The urge to modernize is an integral feature of the human society. Every society arises out of and expresses the triumph of mankind over nature, or reconstructs the opacity of nature into patterns of habitability in a unique way. All of us have our own ways of organizing or reformatting the nature, okay, tinkering with nature, and making it habitable. Okay, human societies, always tends to make the opacity of nature, struggle or overcome the opacity of nature and make nature habitable. On the other hand, he doesn't see the process of modernizing, the process of building diverse institutions by reformatting nature as leading to modernity, which entails a sequential process of questioning, rethinking, destabilizing, and eventually reconstructing the institution one builds. Chakravarti feels that when it comes to non-European societies or civilizations, the urge to modernize by building infrastructure and institutions was not so much absent as the urge to rethink and transform these institutions into paradigms of human emancipation, an urge that stood as the measure of one's modernity. So modernity had something to do with rethinking, okay, with analyzing, with rethinking, with self-reflexivity. Modernity was the pace associated modernity with that. Chakravarti also goes on to obliquely dwell on the futility of attempting to find sites of early modernity in non-European society. This is because he thinks that the incessant interplay between modernization and modernity, building and rethinking institutions and infrastructure, which stood as a feature of European societies during 17th and 18th century, was absent elsewhere. Chakravarti claims that though pre-colonial societies made massive contribution to the modernization process, breaking the isolation of provinces and the barrier between them and the outer world, or initiating close commercial exchange, as the Mughals did in the context of pre-colonial India, according to Jadunath Sarkar in his volume The Fall of Mughal Empire. The urge to engage in self-reflexive debates concerning the modernizing process they had initiated remains elusive to the gaze of historians till now. Dipesh Chakravarti states, if it is true that thinkers in India in the early modern period engaged in self-reflexive debates about institutions that eventually constituted our modernization, then historian would be able to bring to life such ancestors from pre-colonial India whose reflections on their own time is worthy of our contemporary passions and disagreements. When it came to the question of whether or not early modern was an apt way of periodizing history of the pre-colonial societies, for Dipesh it is essential to find out which South Asian thinker one needs to wrestle with in thinking about democratic forms of public life. While arguing why the phrase early modernity corresponds well with the European context, Chakravarti states, European early modernity matters in part because 17th and 18th century debates in political philosophy are relevant to all discussions of modernity or postmodernity. Today, Hobbes and Spinoza still remain pertinent to arguments on democracy in a way that may not find parallels in other instances of the early modern. Now, let us talk about the problems of periodizing modernity. Now, critics have approached periodization as an exercise in reducing the complexities of time or complex folds of time, or rearranging the overlapping, entangled nature of time into a linear sequence, into a chronological sequence. Now, stressing the contrivance of historic periodization, Johann Gustav Droysen observes, in history there are no epochs, just as the lines of the equator or of the tropics are not in the world. They are only forms of observation which the thinking spirit gives to the empirically existent. However, periodization did not so much express the humanist art, rather it stood as a form of restricted provincial thinking driven by a determination to align the complex folds or the aberrations of time and space with the Western progressivist vision of history. Worse, these periodizations were seen as an inherent component of Eurocentric colonial practices. The modern conception of history rests on an influential mode of periodization, the triad of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern era. The tripartite division of history gradually emerged from the humanist cultural disdain for the immediate past. Its origins are usually traced back to the Italian cleric and the poet Francisco Petrarch. The pejorative othering perspective on the culture of the past millennium, in contrast to his own time, gave birth to the notion of the Middle Ages, based on a twofold distinction: the now of Renaissance humanism and the before. However, this before inherently implies a third period. Renaissance humanists saw their own age as a revival of a lost intellectual heyday, namely of the Roman Empire. Between this past, which they aspired to regain, and the present lay an epoch of cultural decline, the Middle Ages. Middle Ages became synonymous with cultural decline. Now, Reinhard Koselleck's conception of a pivotal shift in historical perspectives and self-perception around 1800 has been particularly influential in this regard. According to Koselleck, in the modern understanding of history, the past is bygone, not accessible anymore. Let me repeat again. According to Koselleck, in the modern understanding of history, the past is bygone, not accessible anymore, and the future is conceived as open, separable, and separate from past and present. What people were expecting from the future stood in an ever increasing contrast to what the experiences were of the present. Their space of experience and the horizon of expectations widened increasingly. Koselleck's work provided evidence to understand modernity as qualitatively different, not only in terms of industry, politics, or demographics, but also in the fundamental way individuals experience time and situated themselves within history. Understanding modernity as qualitatively different corroborated in return the divisions of epochs of antiquity into antiquity, Middle Ages, and modernity, as it was delineated since the 16th century and firmly established within the academic historiography in the 19th century as stations on the way to modernity, as not yet. In the words of Chris Loring, the teleology of modernity can thus be understood as the birthmark of Western periodization. As Julia Angster shows in an article, this fundamental shift was closely connected to the modern concept of progress and strongly builds on the premise of the Middle Ages as a regressive period. In the words of Chris Loring, the teleology of modernity can thus be understood as the birthmark of Western periodization. As Julia Angster shows in an article, the fundamental shift was closely connected to modern concept of progress and strongly builds on the premise of the Middle Ages as a regressive period. Thank you.